Welcome to Yoga Teachers Masterclass Series 3. I'm Paula Midden, and today I'm speaking with Richard Freeman. Richard began his practice of yoga in college in 1968, and in the same period he attended the Zen temple at Matsuka Roshi in Chicago. As a student of philosophy, the political and cultural circumstances of the time took him to India to practice and explore schools of yoga and bhakti. As a monk, he traveled throughout India and Southeast Asia, and in 1974 he began teaching yoga in the Middle East. Richard has been an avid student of both the Iyengar and the Ashtanga Vinyasa methods, their relationship to similar practice and their application to each individual. He remains a student of comparative philosophy and is interested in the interfacing of different cultures and practices, both historically and most importantly in the current world. He and Mary Taylor founded the yoga workshop in Boulder, Colorado in 1988. And currently they teach ways of practicing yoga and meditation throughout the world in the context relationship to other people. Instructional videos he made in the 90s on Ashtanga yoga set the gold standard for the contemplative practice of this form. And he is the author of The Mirror of Yoga, the co-author of The Art of Vinyasa, and soon to be released translation of the Bhagavad Gita, When Love Comes to Light. Richard, thank you so much for joining me. I'm really excited to get to talk to you today.
Oh, thank you.
This series is all about teaching beyond the asana and how we can honor the ancient traditions of the practice. And I suppose, you know, with yoga becoming more popular than ever, and we're seeing more and more teachers, I suppose there's the concern that we get focused very much on the physical, and even within that we lose the traditions of the practice. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, and really how we can continue to do what we're doing without losing that connection with the traditional aspect of the practice.
Oh,
big topic.
That's a tall order. Yeah, but I think it's important to realize that in all the yoga traditions, you need to focus, and at a certain level, what you're focusing on is sensation, which is very physical, or right in your face, so to speak. But then to look at it mindfully, more and more deeply, so you start to see that it's much more than you thought it was. And so the physical is then considered sacred or divine, and the physical contains that which is infinite, which would include all of the different levels of mind. And so it's rather than an either or choice in which you have to just forget the body completely and forget the real world, which is coming up constantly as our circumstances. You start to reframe it and revision it, and that way you can include all of the different, say, limbs of the classical eightfold path of yoga. And really, you have to have all of the limbs in order to go deeply. And a nice thing about that classical approach, which is what Ashtanga means, or 8 limbs, is that it makes you look at all the different aspects of your life, particularly other beings, which means relationships with other beings. And then within that, your relationship to other belief systems and other approaches to the same art. And so most systems, beginners in them, they misunderstand what's being taught, but they're happy to have some kind of new family to cling on to. And then, so there's a period that everyone goes through, probably a few times a day, of kind of a fundamentalism in which you mistake the thing you're doing or the ideas you have for the whole thing. Just like your theory of yourself. Like, I think about myself, but those aren't really me. But since you're going to do that anyway, you just have to watch the process very, very closely and keep returning to that process of what's going on and questioning. And this manifests also in the ability to eventually look at what other people are thinking, even within your own cult, your own family, and then the ones across the street, the ones across the island, and then around the world, and perhaps, often other planets. And so a lot of the mythology associated with both all the different schools of yoga and in the imagination of the poets who wrote the poems, talk about almost interplanetary, interuniversal yoga adventures, where you're flying to many different universes and planets, and then dealing with fear, and then communicating and discovering, oh, there is the beloved in those other beings. And so that's the essential process that makes it work. And so my experience is that's what, eventually, once you become grounded or relieved from your initial sense of loneliness and suffering, by finding something that to you gets you in touch with what is infinite, then you have to, not stop there. The ego wants to stop and say, oh, it's all, this kind of yoga, or this form of God, or this particular idol, or this particular teacher, but if you look closely at any of them, you'll see that no, there's a lot of stuff behind everything. And so I think, the communication is the key.
Okay.
And then when you communicate, then you get curious about, well, what are they reading, those other people, that other country? And that's the beginning of a whole, very long adventure.
Mm-hmm. And do you find that this process starts to unfold naturally in students, or do you as a teacher sort of encourage that process?
I think it would unfold naturally, but sometimes you've got to give it a little push by asking questions to people, or encourage them to go and study a little bit more. Because particularly in today's world, you find something that does it for you, and you're afraid to actually to go out and look. So you had this wonderful spiritual experience, and then your mind, your ego comes and wraps it in a package, and it basically is lying in wait to exploit almost any experience that you have. And so the basic mindfulness practice that is common to all of the yoga schools that I've studied deeply, all of the Buddhist and other contemplative schools, in the Middle East, make you look again. Like say, oh, you notice the thought, like a cloud coming through the sky, you notice it, and then you go, and so that no longer is it, you're giving it space. You're not following its story. And in that way, you can see through basically all kinds of stories that the mind creates. And so rather than getting rid of the ego, you see that ego is traditionally in many schools, and ultimately, the tantric schools like to really claim this, but it's also in every other school, that it's a divine function. And so they call it, within the Sankhya system, which is very old, they call it Daivi Prakriti. And the Bhagavad Gita, Daivi, which means divine, and Prakriti is creative energy, which is empty of self. There's, it's not you, it's like your body, your hair, your vehicle, but not to be, looked upon with disdain. You don't look down on it, because that would just be more Prakriti looking down on Prakriti. But you touch it, oh, this is a divine process, and actually a delightful process. And so, but that takes the word yoga means to link together. And so, you're linking two different things. And when they truly link, then you see that they're actually not separate, that they're interdependent. And so it's actually very advanced to do any kind of yoga.
And you were saying that you ask the questions to get people.
Yeah.
So can you give us an example of the kinds of questions that you start to ask that bring up this process?
Well, for example, the classical question is, they'll make a statement, and you just give them the opposite. A simple form of that is, you just ask, well, who are you? And of course, then they give you the natural answer. I am Richard Freeman, and this is the mythology, or the one of zillions of stories. And then you just smile, and then you say, no, who are you? And you emphasize the you to mean not you in the ordinary sense, but you in the special sense. And so a lot of it is a linguistic trick to get people to look at the opposite idea, but not to even accept the opposite idea, just to see, oh, look what my mind is doing. And so if I say the universe is, and then people say, I just discovered that the universe is. And then say, oh, look again. And then 10 minutes later, I just discovered that the universe is not. Oh, you're in trouble. Okay. And then they discover that it both is and is not. And then they discover that it is neither is or is not. And this is what in the teaching of Nagarjuna, who was the great Mahayana philosopher, called the Four Corners, which are reflected in both, Greek thought and in the early Vedanta. And they would call it negative dialectics, which doesn't sound very positive. But it allows you to watch the patterning of mind. And so you'll see that there's, it's actually a delightful, beautiful patterning to watch. And in terms of those theories and those myths that are deep inside of us, the ones we really identify with, that takes bouncing off of other people, like parents, children, the other people who are from different cultures that you might have unconscious assumptions about, prejudices about. And so, and that of course happens historically in yoga schools or religious schools, that's the whole history of humanity, right?
Yes, yeah. And so I want to ask you a bit about the Bhagavad Gita, because I know you're soon releasing the translation on the Bhagavad Gita, and certainly in this series, there hasn't been so much talk about it. There's been more focus on the sutras.
Oh yeah.
So
yeah.
I'd love you to talk a little bit about what we can learn from the Bhagavad Gita.
Yeah, well, the Bhagavad Gita is part of this very large storybook called the Mahabharata, which was written by, in my opinion, a very clever poet who was much smarter than we think he is, or was, or she.
Yeah.
And it is describing, the mess that comes from religious beliefs of all types. Good beliefs that allow you to create a human society and allow you to function and relate to environment, and then the attachment to those familial attachments, and then the mess that comes about, when particularly certain egos arise, who then bring on war and conflict, and so some people read the Gita thinking, well, Arjuna is being asked just to do his duty like a good policeman, and just kill these people and stop worrying about it, because they don't die anyway. So what's the problem? And our opinion of that is no. What's being taught is that Arjuna is waking up in the middle of a battlefield between these two very large armies. And ultimately, the text reveals that both armies are part of a single family, a very extended family. And so and Arjuna sees friends and relatives and teachers on both sides, and he says, this is crazy. What are we doing? And so it works to kind of reveal the absurdity of religious belief when the lower functions of mind, so in the Sankhya teaching, which is kind of exposed in the Bhagavad Gita, when one becomes rajasic, and so you start defending your religion by needing to chop the heads off of the opposing side. And yet it plays a paradox where if Arjuna was so, well, he just wanted to collapse in the tamasic, where he just, I can't deal with this. And so Krishna, his intelligence, and ultimately the beloved in the heart of all beings, saying, no, try this. And so Krishna would present systematically through the Gita all of these different schools, but he would present them in a way that did not satisfy his very close friend Arjuna on purpose. A lot of people don't realize that Krishna was being clever and was misleading Arjuna purposely, so that Arjuna would say, wait a minute, that doesn't make any sense. And so the book challenges your understanding of Buddhism, because he makes thousands of subtle references to Buddhism. If you know the language, and if you know the teachings of the Mahayana, and he picks apart and reforms the school of Sankhya, which is very big, and in a sense frees you from the misunderstandings of it. And then all of the questions around action and inaction, and is it better to be a monk or better to be a college professor, or all of these different questions. And it ends up where he's saying, you have to give up all of the dharmas, which are all the different systems of belief, good and bad, that you use minute by minute. It's not that you discard them, but you have to offer them, give them up, release them. They are actually divine prakriti. And he says, just come to me. And he says, basically, Sharanam, come to me and take shelter, because I'm your friend, basically. And so he's pointing out that their friendship was more important than anything. And so Krishna presents himself as, the universal form of the entire universe, as death itself, where he's terribly frightening. He's chewing off the heads of all sentient beings and scares Arjuna to death. But he says, but also Arjuna, that which is right up in your face right now, which is just us hanging out, that's also fine. And so he gets Arjuna to look again and to look again and to look again and to question, keep asking questions. And so they say at the end of the book, the Sanjaya, who's relating the whole dialogue to a blind king, he's saying, and Sanjaya, who's psychic, who's witnessing all this, he says, my hair is standing on end as I listen to the dialectic, or the continuous back and forth talk, questioning of Arjuna and Krishna. And so it's basically teaching exactly the same as taught in the Theravadan Buddhist school, where you, anapanasati, you just keep going back, look again. Oh, that was nice, but look again, look again. And almost as a joke, in the Sanskrit, they're saying again, oh, and look again. Oh, and they use the word samsmriti. Smriti means memory. I remember this dialogue, but it's the smriti is the word that's used for mindfulness. It means memory, but it means memory in the attentive present moment rather than being sentimental. It's hard to explain the Gita. One has, but I think it's one of the most brilliant and funny texts. But you have to be honest, because it rubs many people the wrong way, particularly in this day and age, particularly when it's used to justify a fascist move by a totalitarian.
But it's very relevant, even though it's so ancient, right? It's still very relevant today in what we're seeing in the world.
Amazing.
And seeing in the practice.
So much. It's just astonishing how relevant.
And even what you were saying at the, when we started talking first about where we start with the very physical, and then we look again, right? And we start to see all the different layers, and it all starts to, what we thought we were doing starts to change, right?
Yeah. And so I think it teaches what's in the Yoga Sutra, but in a way that confronts you as a student much more. And that's its brilliance. And of course, it's been represented traditionally by many people who have an axe to grind, or a cult to reinforce, or and that would be natural historically. But now in today's world, there's so much information available, and we're all culturally running into each other constantly. And what a mess.
And Richard, in your translation of the Bhagavad Gita, do you go into that? Do you explain your view like you're speaking here now?
Oh, we try. My wife and I wrote the book, and we try to explain it. And then if we fail to, really communicate, we would just say, well, practice. We just want to get someone excited about the subject, and then they'll start studying it themselves.
So it is a really good place for people to start to dive into the Bhagavad Gita and start to get a really clear picture of of what it stands for and how they can use it in the modern world.
Exactly. Yeah.
So Richard, before we finish up, we're just a little over, but before we finish up, do you want to add anything to wrap up, or have you any last words to give to us on the subject?
Yeah, in relation to what we call traditional yoga practice, my advice for students and teachers is basically be nice. Because that, be nice to your body. If you notice that you're using any type of yoga practice as a form of self-punishment, do notice that. It's natural. You can then forgive yourself and be nice to yourself, and then you'll be nicer. Because if you have not only yourself, but you have other beings in your heart, breathing is much easier. And if you try to do pranayama, which is a very wonderful, powerful practice, but there's any being in the whole universe that you have located outside of your heart, your pranayama won't work, because that'll upset the flow through the nadis, or the little rivulets of sensation patterns that manifest as the body. And so if you can put everybody in your heart, then breathing is easy. Otherwise, keep working at it.
Thank you so much, Richard. It's been a pleasure. We could
thank you, Paul.
Talk all day. But thank you for joining us, and thank you to everybody for watching today.
Oh, thank you all.